Good morning, all, and really appreciate your time this morning and taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend this one. Again, like we mentioned in the invites, we'll be great a deep dive into the Flare overhaul and the security overhaul with Flare itself. Before I jump into it, my name is Tristan Govender. I am the CTO for CRS Cyber Retaliator Solutions. My role specifically engages around the solutions that we have on board. It's my pleasure to be able to take you through today's demo as the Flare lead for Africa. With regards to CRS, Cyber Retaliator Solutions is an authorized IBM RedHat SUSE CompTIA and Agile Training Center, as well as a value-added cybersecurity distributor. We are based in Centurion, South Africa, operating through Africa and North America. We're a proud African distributor for Flare, and it's a solution that we have focused on today. The purpose of today's essentially the webinar that we're going to be taking you through today is focused specifically around Flare.io and its capability to very quickly get you into a space where you understand your external exposure management. There's a couple of issues that various different companies deal with, and especially within the enterprise space, we are getting to a point where we have a constantly shifting attack surface and a very high stakes practice within our businesses. Even the smallest cybersecurity incidents are taking large companies out, right? And that means that it is being their downfall. And a large component of this is coming to the fact that it is now credential leaks and things like exposed identities that is being an issue in organizations. The modern corporate reality is that we have increased cloud and SaaS adoption that does not allow us to have an intuitive means of handling our attack surface. This means that digital identities are very scattered and assets are unknown and protected and unprotected. So the cybercrime ecosystem is increasingly reliant on professional marketplaces. So when we are taking a look at where they're actually getting this information from, it is generally sold from our own organizations, right? So as an example, they get the credentials from our organizations, from our devices, and sell them onto open marketplaces or share them via Telegram market groups. So that leads to an exponentially growing number of breaches with increasingly high consequences for all types of organizations. That brings us exactly into Flare itself. So Flare combines these three different categories of cyber threat intelligence, digital risk protection, and external attack surface management to give you a comprehensive solution that is able to give you your full attack surface so that you can get to the why of a threat, into what is actually happening or why is this threat taking place. And that is giving us the ability to see things like dark web, threat actor profiling, which tells us exactly who these threat actors are, as well as supply chain exposures, which tells us externally what other organizations are being breached that is now affecting us. It also brings us to digital risk protection, so things like identity intelligence and brand monitoring, domain monitoring, as well as takedown services. How do we actually protect our company name from these types of breaches that then take place? And finally, also take a look at attack surface management. So what is exposed out there about my organization? What is exposed data, the cloud services, open ports, all of our vulnerabilities? So these are generally how they're actually getting in. And without a solution like Flare, you generally have very little visibility over how an attacker is actually looking at your organization from an external perspective. Now, of course, there are other solutions in the market, but Flare is incredibly easy to use, right? And that brings us into what makes them different. Within the first 5 minutes of actually using Flare, you would be able to already get insights into what is exposed about your organization. Within that first 30 minutes, which I'll take you through today, is exactly where you get the value of Flare. They're also one of the leaders in giving you that exposure to ransomware and breach causes. What has actually happened? What type of information do they have? Am I able to reclaim some of that information? These are all questions that Flare helps us to answer. In addition to that, they have world-class coverage and data collection, which I'll get into when I jump into the demo. Above and beyond that, we also see the ability to have identity exposure management. So this capability essentially allows us to do things like automate our qualification of credentials that are now out there on the dark web and the clear web or Telegram groups, and then be able to automatically respond. So the way that this works is by using an integration with your Azure application, and you would be able to see that you can do things like revoke the user sessions, invalidate your refresh tokens, and disable user accounts or mark the accounts as compromised. All of this automation allows you to very quickly reduce the level of risk that you have to that exposed credential being used against you in a live attack. It also gives you visibility over something that we call deep blast radius. So you would be able to see what your exposure is actually going to lead to in a snowball process, right? What other accounts are using these same credentials from an internal perspective, right? We all know that you cannot specifically control how your employees come up with these passwords all the time, but you can put the password policies around them. But once they are breached and once they're exposed, it's very difficult to then control it. So this blast radius gives us a lot better control over that type of scenario. And just to showcase to you, we have a large market validation within the local markets of South Africa and surrounding regions. Within these areas such as healthcare, entertainment, insurance, finance, government, retail, as well as all of our managed service partners who do things like VAP service enhancement by using Flare, those who have integrated into their SOC services for threat intelligence. There's managed service partners who specifically also provide Flare as a service in itself, as well as takedown services to be able to remove areas of or remove all of those sources that are out there that organizations don't specifically want, right? For example, things like lookalike domains, blog sites, and various different other creative sources that we've seen from all of our various different customers. Within region, we've got over 50 different customer tenants that are in use. We have base providers of 8 within the region. And within 2025, we had over 300 takedowns that were performed. So it's an incredibly intuitive solution, incredibly easy to use, and it's one that is in high level of usage within the local market. You can feel free to post any of your questions in the chat box, but without further ado, I'm actually going to jump straight into a demo. Like we said, this session is a short one for a specific reason of giving you the crux of what Flare is about and what value it's able to bring either to you or your customers' organizations. So the first thing that we need to talk about is the sources of Flare. Flare is the most comprehensive coverage of dark and clear web data, specifically with regards to stealer logs. If you're not aware of what stealer logs are, they're a form of malware that silently steals confidential logs such as browser data, session cookies, and system information that are that is designed to very quickly and easily steal that information and avoid detection. So that means that they are taking all of that data that you essentially save to your browser, that your employees save to their browsers, in addition to session cookies that you might have stored on that browser, and they use that maliciously against you. Play is incredibly transparent with all of their sources, so it's not only steal logs, you can see the different types of communities that they actually monitor, the ransomware groupings that they monitor, and they show you whether they are actively up or down. So you can view by source, and you can actually see which ones are new, and they're constantly adding, when they actually got events, and they incredibly transparent about these types of sources. Okay. Above and beyond that, you can see that they monitor Telegram as well. So they're one of the most comprehensive monitoring solutions for Telegram in itself. And you might think that, okay, Telegram is just a messaging app, but this is actually predominantly where majority of cyber breaches are starting from. As in, what ends up happening is the progression of an attack is that they infect you through a link like through YouTube or any of the other sites that you might see. They get you to download something through that link that exfiltrates the device's data into a command and control server. The logs are then loaded onto the dark web and then sold, or they are communicated freely through something like Telegram. The threat actors then buy those credentials for $2 to $10 generally, and then shares them through various different sources, again, like Telegram, once they are actually purchased. They use those credentials to log in and then attempt to lock you out. So that's generally what we see in today's context. I'm sure that many of you know stories of organizations who have been locked out of their Microsoft accounts, or organizations who have been locked out of their enterprise security accounts. And this is generally how that happens. They get this exposure that they are unaware of, and it becomes a large issue to them. The next thing that we take a look at is how does Flare actually allow you to reference this massive amounts of data? And it's quite simple. They use something called identifiers. So from what we see here, you would be able to load identifiers that are in the categories of domains, keywords, identities, your Azure tenants, queries, which can be complex or simple queries. You've got bin numbers to do credit card monitoring and to do financial service monitoring. We've got massive use cases for that as well. IP addresses, passwords, and GitHub repositories. So you would be able to put down as much monitoring as you possibly can for your entire attack surface, and Flare does the rest. They find everything that is going to be related to the exposures of your organization. So let's take a look at that. The events that we then find are going to be something that we want to look at the criticals first. And that's generally going to be, for example, things like ransomware leaks. So in the context of ransomware leaks, we've actually had situations where organizations were unaware that they were hit by ransomware yet until they used Flare to actually see that there was a note that was sent to them, but that wasn't received. So in this instance, we can see that there's a ransomware event. You can see the context of the message that was actually shared, and we can see if there were any leaked files. Now, in this context, we can see that there was actually leaked files, and if you wanted to actually get them back, Flare, majority of the time, is able to find those files too. Okay, so it gives you context around what is actually involved in that ransomware or ransomware event that has taken place. In addition to that, they also have the AI assist feature that is going to break down the context on this event so that if you have to explain this to higher levels of management in a maybe a more structured way, then you can use these AI assist features to be able to help you break down the event. And it also gives you remediation actions that you can take place. So you would be able to see specifically for example, a quick summary. You can get the ransomware details of exactly what happened, and you would be able to get context over what your remediation guidance should be. So it's incredibly specific to the events that we then see. Now, above and beyond that, like I said, one of the more critical ones is generally stealer logs, and we see this predominantly as one of the most intriguing parts of our Flare demos, because organizations think that they are so secure until they actually put their domains into something like Flare. So here you'd be able to see that it actually gives you what the host site is. It'll give you the username and the passwords to be used. A lot of the time in these instances, you see things like the Microsoft accounts that are then exposed. You see things like corporate entities and their profiles that are exposed, the financial service, Sage One and Sage passwords and usernames. There are some more nefarious ones that are a bit more embarrassing to executives that do get used against them, right? And this is the place where you would be able to find it, right? It's bringing all of that information to the forefront. Everything that you see in Flare is already out there about the organization. Now, let's take a look at a couple ones that are less critical, but still of high importance, and that's things like lookalike domains. Some of the lookalike domains means that someone is likely impersonating your domain or impersonating uh, information that you do not want out there. For example, if we have a GitHub repository that is now hosting information about us that we do not want, we'd be able to do a takedown. Okay, so Flare does offer takedown services at a very affordable rate that makes it incredibly intuitive. And one of the biggest things about these takedowns is if it is unsuccessful, you get that takedown back into your pool. So no, you are not paying for unsuccessful takedowns. You are paying for best effort takedowns, but if it is not taken down, you get to have another chance at another takedown. Okay, so that gives you financial benefit for the takedown scheme. Okay, you'd be able to see the raw packages for this as well. And like we said, more critical ones is, for example, lookalike domains. You'll be able to see the history of that domain, if there were any changes that took place, and you can see, for example, you can take these down as well. Now, takedowns are not just limited to GitHub and lookalike domains. They also are on things like social media sites. They are for various other sources, like in cases where blog sites are now impersonating your brand, various different instances that we'd be able to go through. But takedowns are quite a vast array of what is or vast functionality that you'll be able to offer either as a service or maybe internally in your organization you want to be able to take down specific sites that are now impersonating you. This is what Flare is here for. Okay. Above and beyond that, there's also the credential browser that actually consolidates all of those credentials that we then see. So, for example, you would be able to actually see what the URL is, you would be able to see the username and the password for those specific users. Now, for anyone who actually wants to try these, keep in mind that this is a demo account. Obviously, for security purposes, we are not doing live demos on customer accounts and any partner accounts. But specifically, if you want to be able to see what your exposure is or what your customers' exposures are so that you can bring it to them, you will see a link in the chat box to be able to start a Flare POC. Okay. The identity profiles are also where we'd be able to see things like the exposure and the blast radius that I showed you earlier. So if you integrate this with your Azure AD, you would be able to qualify a lot of these passwords, especially if you've got things like single sign-on, if you've got things set up for your SAML integration, you would be able to see where the credentials are actually validated, and then you would be able to make sure that you are remediating these types of exposures. In addition, like we said, that you've got the ability to have the sandbox components for Flare. So like we said, you would be able to go through the motion of getting your files back, but sometimes those files are coming back with malicious payloads. So we'd be able to have the analysis of those files and the URLs directly within Flare. You can either upload them or find them within Flare or add the URL. Okay. You'd be able to have an interactive sandbox or have a background analysis. To then load up your environment, you can open up your files. So here we can see that there was a Mimikatz implementation that was then, or Mimikatz payload that is now within that specific file. So we can see if there is Mimikatz to get back any of the passwords, and there's no results. You get a complete assessment for that report so that you would be able to see if those files were actually malicious or not. Okay, this is actually embedded in Flare itself, so works incredibly intuitively alongside the other features of Flare. Above and beyond that, we also see supply chain ransomware exposure. So, for example, if there are any external organizations that are now mentioning our organization, we would want to be able to get visibility about that. So Beam Me Up Steelworks has been through a ransomware event, but our organization, Scatterhold, is now mentioned in those events. So we want to be able to get visibility of that instance. Okay, so a key component of this is also looking into that event specifically and seeing what leak files are there relating to us, which is the same event that we looked at earlier. And these are the files that are saying that there is scatter halt mentioned in the files. So then we can decide whether or not that third party or supply chain is now going to affect us. Above and beyond that, Flare uses all of these sources that they have to be able to give us threat intelligence. So as part of the solution, they have something called threat flow, and you can create custom-based intel based on questions or based on queries that you would be able to build. And then you would have intelligence feeds that you can specifically have catered towards you. Okay, so these come with backends of the actual events as well. So you'll be able to see all of the threads that are taking place, the conversations that are happening, and translation is built into Flare as well so that you will be able to get more context. Reporting is part of the tools, okay? But also from a dashboarding perspective, it helps you to make sure that you are reducing on the amount of exposure that you have over periods of time. All of these are time-driven charts, and they ensure that over a period of time, you are actually reducing your external exposure, okay? The biggest insights and the biggest value adds of Flare is going to be when you test the solution yourself. So I'm hoping that you all got a very good insight over what Flare is about. And I'm looking forward to taking any of your questions and also making sure that you have that you have registered for your own Flare POC. You can feel free to post your questions into the chat box. Fantastic. So Flare fitting into a standard AV and EDR environment. Keep in mind that Flare is more on the external exposure side of things, right? So where we have our traditional security tools like EDR and on the AV, which is going to be monitoring for internal exposure, Flare is looking at what is already out there about the organization. So you can get ahead of a potential attack that is going to take place based on information that attackers are able to find out about the organization. Keep in mind also that Flare is more on the enterprise level of where your positioning would be. So you think of organizations with 500 employees plus. However, if you do have a requirement for Flare, we do have managed service partners and the providers that are able to also cater to, let's say, the requirement that you have as a smaller organization as well, especially if you are in the SME space. So Flare works based on the number of identifiers, so or rather, let's say the tenants that you would take on board. So there's different models that you would be able to go by. So I'd recommend that we set up a session to be able to see how Flare is able to cater to your specific use case, either as a customer or as a partner, so that we can take a look at the different partnership models that we have. Are there any further questions? Okay, so you can see that we do have some further questions. Fantastic. Yes. You will all receive the meeting recording as well as further details around Flare. Please also expect a call from myself within the next day or two to ensure that we also get your next steps with Flare. We want to make sure that you all have some insights on how to test out the platform. Okay, I see a question there. How do we see platforms such as Flare evolving from alerting on exposures to actually influencing remediation priorities in real time? So the biggest thing about where we see Flare going as a platform on alerting to exposures is going into the actual alerting components. So like we said, we can set up different alert channels. So we'll be able to go through different alerting channels like email or plugging in Flare into a SOC. So anytime that credentials are loaded onto the dark web and are found based on your identifiers, you get real-time visibility over those types of events. Above and beyond that, we're also able to set up alert channels like email, Slack, teams so that you get real-time visibility over threats that actually take place, or you'd be able to roll them up into daily updates, weekly or monthly updates. But if you wanted real time, then you would notify as soon as possible. And generally, we see a large number of those integrations going into something like your Sentinel. So we'd also be able to have additional integrations, like you can see your Entra ID. You'd be able to do those integrations, webhooks. You'd be able to also integrate into your other SIEM solutions through the webhooks as well. Okay. There's different models of how Flare is priced. So you can either do it via your reseller programs. You've got MSSP programs who've also got a list of partners that are able to give you different commercial models depending on whether you are a customer or whether you are a partner that's also trying to sell Flare with a managed service attached to it. Okay. Player can also identify credit card numbers. So I see that question. So yes, correct. You're able to identify credit card numbers through the BIN numbers. So that is generally one of the larger use cases that we see with financial services. I see additional questions there. So it's a reactive tool. Can we lock it down? Can we lock down external traffic as a response, or is it purely for monitoring? So it's not a tool that you essentially use for locking down the traffic itself, right? You would need to look at where that exposure originated from and tighten up your security controls internally based on the exposures that have taken place. So from specifically where Flare's standpoint comes from is that it's originating from the outside and giving you that visibility and that exposure. Okay. Historical leaks and active exploits is done in two different ways. So we got a question there from Paul. So how does Flare differentiate between historical leaks and active exploitable exposures? So there's two different components here. One is there's multiple different date options of where we actually see those credentials coming from, as an example. Okay, so you'd be able to see the date that it was found, the date that it was leaked at, and the date that it was breached at. So these different dates give us a lot more content about the actual breach itself. Now, obviously, in certain instances, these dates might not be available because the attackers would be loading it on specific dates. Like for example, historically, if they are before the 2022 period, it's generally quite difficult to see when it is leaked at and breached at. However, Flare is continuously working on these metrics to make it much more accurate. Okay. Another one, how much of analysis can be automated before the human factor before the human factor becomes legitimate, essential for decision making? Sorry, so read that again. How much of the analysis can be automated before the human factor becomes legitimate and essential for decision making? So a large component of that is going to come down to essentially that Entra ID component that I spoke about. So for example, if you are doing the integration into Entra ID and there's one coming up for Okta as well, you would also get some deep insights over those which will do the analysis and do the verification of whether the credential actually is legitimate and something that is exploitable. And then from there, you can either have Flare, which will send a responsive action to those two systems, Entra ID or Okta, or you would be able to send out an alert to your SOC to be able to investigate further and be able to action accordingly based on the playbooks of an organization. Okay. What is the ROI compared to hiring a dedicated threat intel team? So threat intelligence team is obviously going to be a fairly costly exercise, right? You need to also consider the fact that human error comes into play a lot more than none. So, for example, like we are saying that Flare has billions worth of credentials that are out there about the organization. Now, as a threat intelligence team, to find all of those sources yourself is incredibly difficult. It's not just incredibly difficult, but it's almost near impossible to be able to consolidate those sources specifically for your organization. Now, I like to say it as you don't know what you don't see, right? So, for example, you may be thinking that you've got all the visibility that you need until the point where something is coming out of the blind side, right? It's coming out to blindside you. So, a threat intelligence team is a great tool, but in addition to using smart tooling like Flare, okay? We've got another one there from Michaela. So, how does Flare differentiate between true risk and noise when monitoring clear and dark web data, especially for large enterprises and massive digital footprints? So, one of the things that you would be able to do with your identifiers is also the ability to narrow down on our exclusions. So, as part of the policies, you would be able to do ignored terms to be able to really focus on only what you want to be able to monitor for. This has been something that we've implemented at various different corporate identities at the moment. Like we said, we have quite a few use cases within the insurance industry, within finance, within even the education sector that actually has that problem with alert noise in general. So adding something like Flare, we need to make sure that whatever they are seeing is really tailored down to only what is relevant to them. And that is exactly where these policies come into play. And we'll be able to create those policies from matching policies to ignore term policies as well. Can Flare be integrated with other tool sets such as help desk centers? Yes, that is correct. So your ITSM tooling as well as your SIM tooling, let's say your SOC tool sets that you've got, it's all something that you would be able to integrate into. Okay. Okay, Kashif has a question. So, where do you typically see the biggest gaps when organizations try to operationalize intelligence from platforms like Flare into their broader security programs? So, the biggest gap that most organizations have is that they do not have control over browser level security as well. So when they have something like Flare, they get a massive shock in seeing the amount of credentials that are actually out there about the organization. So it is a massive issue when it comes to implementing a program like Flare for them, because it means that they have to do a lot of cleanup from their end, as well as a lot of cleanup from an internal policy point of view. Okay, Nigel has a question. How does Flare help with insider threats for employees who leave unhappy? So a large number of time, we also see that employees start to be the ones that share malicious information. And a large part of this is also in organizations who develop code, right? So they would upload source code to public GitHub repositories that then are out there about organizations. And in those cases, we'd be able to offer takedown services from Flare that is able to, one, detect instances of those source code that is then leaked, and then be able to take down those instances. From a reseller POV, how can a business partner turn Flare deployments into recurring revenue streams whilst giving an excellent solution such as Flare bundled with brilliant service offering? So that's the best thing about the new MSSP model that Flare has. And I'm really excited to be able to contact a couple of you to be able to talk about that, which is specifically around making sure that you have flexibility to sell the way that you are comfortable with. So it is a commitment model for the MSSPs that are operating as a SOC service or those who are looking to offer Flare as a managed service. And essentially, you commit to the amount that you believe that you would be able to retrieve within an annual period. And then you take on customers as you would be able to, okay? And then you pay for those customers as you get them, okay? So that means that you can structure your payment term over that yearly period in a way that is most effective for your organization. So, for example, you can pay off that amount monthly. You can pay it off when you're bringing on customers on board. Ultimately, by the end of that term, that commitment amount is something that you pay over. However, it is giving you the flexibility to offer the service without having to worry about your month-to-month cash flow as a partner. Okay, we have a question from Nita. can Flare identify whether a specific threat actor is consistently targeting brand identifiers like IP addresses, corporate emails? And if so, how does that change the stock prioritization of alerts coming from that specific threat actor's preferred distribution channels? So yes, that's exactly. So through the events, you get visibility of the threat actors that are intentionally and actively exploiting you or looking to exploit you, as an example. So it actually tells you what the source is. It'll tell you if there is a specific threat actor group that is there. And in that way, you would be able to research and understand what that threat actor is about, why they are specifically targeting you. Maybe you are part of a broader trend, which is going to come in as part of your threat flow research. Okay. And then based on those instances, you can have a community driven engagement to understand how other organizations have actually gotten out of those situations. So everything that you have as part of Flare is a tool set that helps you to further and robustly respond to these external threats that are now affecting you. Something that generally you would not be able to have visibility over. Okay, perfect. So how do you distinguish between synthetic and fake identities and verified credentials in massive combo lists? So everything is going to be based on, let's say you, for example, if you loaded your domain in, or maybe you're monitoring for specific users. But in this instance, we are looking at, let's say, domain level monitoring, which means that it's bringing in all of our employees that are going to be part of these specific domains. So the actual qualification for the usernames and passwords is generally going to be a fairly difficult one for a large enterprise. However, we've seen instances where organizations just ensure that the users, if they are seen on this list, that they do reset their passwords. And if it is recurring across multiple different, let's say, sites that they are using this password, then security teams do the efforts in making sure that that user is specifically notified, right? There's also various different customers who have built out various different automations around the tool as well, externally from their SIM and SOAR platforms, to be able to send out responses from an organizational perspective to make sure that employees are not reusing that same password and notify them to change their password. And as part of that, they also have policies that lock those employees out of their system until those passwords are then changed because they know that that is going to lead to a much larger breach. So how does Flare handle multi-tenanted environments for MSSPs? Extremely well, right? So that is one of the main use cases for Flare is MSSPs. So one of the components that we then take a look at is, for example, an organization like a SOC that is dealing with multiple different organizations, and you pay per tenant, right? So you pay for the tenant that you specifically taken on for a customer, and you'll be able to have them all on the same Flare, the Flare dashboard, okay? And you would still be able to give the customer access to their specific tenants without providing access to all of the other customer tenants. Okay, there are also multiple different roles like tenant managers and various different uh, access requirements that you would be able to provide to different users that are using Flare. Okay. Can the platform trigger different remediation paths based on the type of exposure? So that is correct. So you would be able to, but not specifically from Flare itself. So like we said, based on the Entra ID and Okta integrations, that answer would be yes. But for example, in the likes of ransomware and let's say the other events that you might see, it'll be able to give you the guidance. But a lot of your remediation actions are actually only going to be able to come from internally within the business and not from Flare itself, right? Because you would need to be able to look at where those breaches are actually coming from in the first place. Okay. I wouldn't say it's a specific limitation, but Michaela, you got a good question there. What are the biggest limitations customers should be aware of? So, or something that Flare is currently working on as part of their roadmap is the ability to do social monitoring, social media monitoring specifically. So the current focus is specifically around credential leaks when we are taking a look at dark web monitoring, all of the sources, Telegram monitoring, and IT risk as a whole. But something that they are working on integrating is social media monitoring. That should be one of the releases that we see within the next coming months. Okay, fantastic. So really appreciate all the questions there. I believe that we've gotten through all of them. Okay. Please expect an email after the session as well, okay, that you will receive the link to be able to sign up for an additional POC, as well as a call from me within the day to be able to set up a session so that we can see what the next steps for Flare are for you. Okay. See that we have a last question there from Diraj. So, what are the competitive products out there that we should be aware of? So, with a pinch of salt, I say this as a leader of Flare within the African context. But again, when we are taking a look at where Flare stands, it is an industry leader. It's been used by X-Force in terms of threat intelligence. That is IBM X-Force threat intelligence. It's been used by various different organizations, and in the context of where we are playing, Flare is incredibly unique in its abilities, right? However, if you are taking a look at specific competitors, we will be able to have a specific conversation around that after the session, and I will share some of the battle cards with the partners that are on the call as well. Okay, I see that we have a question from Blessing there on the takedowns. So, Blessing, there is a agreement that is then signed from the actual customer end. So the customer who is initiating the takedown, even if it's through a partner, they would sign an agreement with Flare that essentially gives them permission to be able to do the takedowns. And then from the takedown end, Flare handles all of the takedowns and has a relationship with the registrars, with the additional agencies like the social media hosting sites like Meta to be able to do those takedowns as well. So, as part of the legal and technical workflow of the takedown, we will be able to set up a separate call to be able to take you through that workflow and the use case for it, as well as the legalities around the documentation that you would sign for those takedowns to take place. Yeah, fantastic. I trust that you all gained a lot of value out of the session. As you can see on the screen, there is our contact information. However, like I mentioned, I will be reaching out to you within the course of today and tomorrow to ensure that you got the value out of the session that you are looking for, right? For the partners, we will also explore different commercial models that are available to you and really looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts.